Thank you for joining us for this last session, renewing our diasporas. This is a topic of more than academic interest for the YIVO Institute, because the YIVO Institute, of course, as many of you know, was born out of the East European diaspora. It was actually conceived in Berlin by East European intellectuals, and then it was given birth in Vilna, Poland, in 1925. The subject of diaspora is a very important one to those who founded this institute. They recognized that the diaspora, although in the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th, there was only the diaspora and a tiny yeshuv, but that the diaspora held the future of the Jewish people. And as they thought, the East European diaspora, which was the largest population of Jews in the world. And consequently, a great deal of thought was given to what this diaspora was all about, what it constituted. As Dubnov wrote, and what was apparent to many, it was the Jewish people spanned numerous states, in each a minority, but in many communities, cities, and so forth, a majority. It was a diaspora that spoke many languages. It was a diaspora that had no army, it had no police, it had no capital city, it had no flag, and yet it was a single entity, or at least those who were thinking about these issues wished to construct a theory, a structure that would conceive of it as a single entity. And so this subject of the relationship of the diaspora to something else, because you say diaspora, you imply there is something else. You imply there is a center. You imply there is a home. The Hungarian diaspora implies a Hungary. The Romanian diaspora implies Romania. But the Jewish diaspora in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, regardless of where it was, did not have such a home. And the homelessness of this diaspora is an aspect of much of what it produced, it seems to me. It's something that is at the foundation of a longing for a home, which ultimately produces Zionism, produces non-territorial Zionism, produces a search for a home. And I guess one of the questions of that we need to consider in this discussion about secularism is whether the Jewish people has a home today, whether that home is in Israel, or whether that home is here in the United States, or whether that home is in a certain consciousness of themselves that they carry with them wherever they went. My grandfather came to the United States shortly after the Revolution, but unlike the majority of us, he did not go from Bremen or some other port across the Atlantic. He walked, as we discovered, as we found out only on his deathbed, he walked across Russia to China. Maybe he had some transportation by train at some point. He never divulged this. He went across the Pacific, not the Atlantic, somehow or other, miraculously or completely accidentally, nobody knows, found himself in St. Louis, Missouri, as a chicken flicker. And for him, that was a meaningless experience. He never talked about it. It meant nothing to him, because wherever he was, there was his God, there was his belief, there was his sense of himself, and his journey was not important. What was important was something that he bore within himself. And it was only at the prodding of my uncle at the very end that apparently he told this story. And so, in a way, that homeland he carried within him wherever he was. And one of the questions that I hope we will be able to talk about a little bit later bears on this question of home, of consciousness, and the relationship of the diaspora to the center. And the reason this is of pressing interest today, well, I think there are many reasons, but quite recently, in the New York Times, in fact, January 29th in the New York Times is an article, Israeli Secularists Appear to Find Their Voice. And in this article, which many of you perhaps have read, Shmuel Leibovitz, an ultra-Orthodox rabbi who runs the Torah Institute of Contemporary Issues in Jerusalem, said the following: "The community is growing and it's perceived as a potential threat to the character of the rest of the country." That is to say, the community of ultra-Orthodox. "The underlying issue is that there's an ideological contest over the soul of the state of Israel and the Jewish people." Later, Yuri Regev, a Reform rabbi who runs Hiddush in Israel, said the following: "There are elements in the making of a Kulturkampf." Now, Kulturkampf was a word that was used in Germany at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, a culture war. And so this question of the growth of secularism, the meaning of secularism, and the role of the diaspora with respect to it is not simply academic, because I think we're seeing in Israel today, and not just on the Upper West Side of New York, these questions being played out concretely and, moreover, politically. And some people, at least, believe that the future of the Jewish people is what is at stake in that playing out. So now I wish to introduce a really extraordinary panelists. The first to speak will be Anthony Polanski. And Anthony is renowned professor who holds the Walter Stern Hilborn Chair in Judaic and Social Studies at Brandeis University. In 1999, he was appointed Albert Abramson Professor of Holocaust Studies, held jointly at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and Brandeis University. He is the author of numerous books, most recently, The Jews in Poland and Russia, and I hope that Anthony will come here to YIVO to speak about that book in the near future. It was awarded the Pro Historia Polanorum Prize by the Senate of the Republic of Poland for the best book on Polish history in a foreign language published in the last 5 years. Next to speak will be Barbara Mann, who is Associate Professor of Jewish Literature and serves as the Simon H. Fabian Chair in Hebrew Literature at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Her areas of expertise include Israeli and Jewish literature, cultural studies, modern poetry, urban studies, literary modernism, and the fine arts. She is author of A Place in History, Modernism, Tel Aviv, and the Creation of Jewish Urban Space, and Space and Place in Jewish Studies. And the last to speak will be Rachel Kafrison, who is a journalist and an attorney in New York City. In addition to her job at a large corporate law firm, Rachel is working on her first book, The Myth of the Yiddish Atlantis, Dynamic Yiddishkeit for the New Millennium, and Rachel will read from her new book, which I can't wait to read myself. So, Anthony, will you begin?
Well, I thank you. I'm very glad to be here. When my flight from London was cancelled on Friday morning, it looked a little unlikely, but due to the enormous efforts of my wife, we did manage to get here. I've called my remarks the East European diaspora in the Jewish imagination. And Shimon Dubnov, who Jonathan has already referred to, has described the history of the Jews since the beginning of the diaspora as that of a succession of autonomous centers. And the center in Poland-Lithuania, which later came under, for the most part, Russian rule, was one of the most remarkable and creative of these. In this area, a major Jewish civilization developed from the 16th century. Subsequently, Hasidism emerged here as a major religious revival. Its Misnagdic opponents created the great Lithuanian yeshivot. Hebrew and Yiddish literature flourished, and new political movements, above all Zionism and Jewish socialism, emerged and transformed the Jewish political landscape. The history of this area in the short 20th century, between the outbreak of the First World War and the collapse of communism in Europe in 1989-91, was tragic. In 1914, 2/3 of the world's Jews lived in this area. Today, 80% live either in the United States or in Israel. And the communities in Russia, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, and Belarus are small and declining. This decline is the result of local integral nationalism, the devastating impact of the genocidal policies of Nazi Germany, and the longer-term destructive consequences of communist rule, particularly in its Stalinist incarnation. Yet since the end of communism, major efforts have been made here to revive Jewish life, although their long-term success is still in question. The majority of Jews in the United States, and probably more than half of the population of Israel, have their roots in this center. Three contrasting attitudes to this center can be discerned. The first sees it as a repository of unchanging and eternal Jewish values. It is well expressed by Abraham Joshua Heschel, himself a scion of a great Hasidic dynasty, in his 1946 book, The Earth is the Lord's. He wrote, "There in Eastern Europe, the Jewish people came into its own. It did not live like a guest in somebody else's house, who must constantly keep in mind the ways and customs of the host. There Jews lived without reservation and without disguise outside their homes, no less than within them. When they used the phrase, 'the world asks,' in their commentaries on the Talmud, they did not refer to a problem raised by Aristotle or Averroes. Their fellow students of Torah were to them the world. Because the ideals of the Ashkenazi Jews were shared by all, the relations between the various parts of the community, between the scholarly and the ignorant, the yeshiva student and the trader, had an intimate, organic character. The earthiness of the villagers, the warmth of the plain people, and the spiritual simplicity of the Magidim or lay preachers penetrated into the Beit HaMidrash, the house of prayer, that was also a house of study and learning. Laborers, peasants, porters, artisans, storekeepers, all were partners in the Torah." A second attitude sees Eastern Europe as a Jewish cemetery, inhabited by unredeemed anti-Semites. This view is exemplified in the underlying assumptions of the March of the Living, at least in its early years. According to an article in the Long Island Jewish World in 1994, many of the young participants came primed with a negative view of Poland as a wasteland populated by anti-Semites. Participants, the article went on, had little or no contact with Poles and so lacked any counter-evidence. William Helmreich, another observer, described the marchers as being, quote, "deeply affected by the prejudiced attitudes they saw in Poland." According to one of these participants, "When I marched in the streets of Poland and no one watched, I realized there are hostile people in the world." Another wrote, "Screams of dirty Jew, swastikas on the walls. This is Poland today, 1996. Imagine what it was like 50 years ago." A more nuanced view is expressed by recent Jewish immigrants from this area and by those who still remain in Eastern Europe. Polish Jewish and Russian Jewish writing, since the end of Soviet communism, often expresses frustration that Israelis and American Jews fail to understand or empathize with their experiences and with their particular understanding of their Jewish identity. In her story Tylko Króciutko, Briefly Now, written in 1994, Hanna Kral, a Polish Jewish writer, describes a group of Polish Jewish women survivors visiting New York in the 1980s. The American Jews that they encounter persistently ask them why they are returning to a country of graves. Their interlocutors, of course, mean Jewish graves, since for them Poland today is a Jewish cemetery. In fact, these women are also returning to Polish graves, since they often survived the war as children adopted by Christian families or have assimilated through mixed marriages. Some have two mothers in both a literal and a symbolic sense. The only person who understands their feelings is an American rabbi who has been escorting them during their trip. The story concludes as follows. The rabbi drove them to the airport. Unlike the others, he didn't ask any questions. He still didn't smell of cheap tobacco, home-baked pastry, and tefillin, like the rabbis of their childhood, but at least he no longer asked any questions. In his recent novel, The Free World, David Bezmogis, a Russian Jewish novelist from Latvia, describes a group of Jewish immigrants from the Soviet Union in the late 1970s, waiting for visas to the United States or Canada. One of them, an unreconstructed communist, is persuaded to attend a showing of the film A Fiddler on the Roof. He is not impressed. On the screen, Samuel saw a fetishistic montage of Jewish symbols, a Star of David, a menorah, a Hebrew letter, the worn burgundy cloth covering the bimah. He looked around and saw, to his surprise, that his wife, his daughter-in-law, and many others were entranced by it. Somewhere in America, Shalom Aleichem was spinning in his grave. The filmmakers had taken his goodbye and turned it into hello. What Shalom Aleichem had meant as an acceptance of a new reality and a critique of the outmoded ways had here been transformed into a sentimental Jewish burlesque. The movie encouraged a wistfulness and a mourning for the past. But what past? The filmmakers had no idea, but Shalom Aleichem could have told them. He had seen enough, even if he'd left America and died there before the worst of the horrors. A great deal of effort has been undertaken in the last 30 years to move beyond these obviously partial views. And one of the most important such initiatives is the Posen Library of Jewish Civilization, whose launch we are celebrating today. Why is this worth doing? It seems to me that the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 did somehow normalize the situation of the Jewish people. Leon Pinsker, the Russian Zionist, argued that what made the Jews hated was their incomprehensibility. Were they a religious or a national group, or were they some combination of these two? In his view, they were a peculiar survival, a ghost, and their ghostliness frightened those around them. With the creation of the State of Israel, Jonathan already alluded to this, the Jews became a nation with a diaspora, like other groups, from the Irish and Scots to the Poles, Greeks, and Chinese. The problem, however, is that most of the Jews of Eastern Europe and their descendants had long left the land of Israel and lived elsewhere. In other words, the diaspora from which they came is not the diaspora which left the land of Israel. And it's for this reason that the complex story of the Jews of Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, and of their contribution to Jewish life and to the culture of the larger world around them, needs to be better known and better understood in the diaspora, in Israel, and also in the countries of Eastern Europe, where its investigation is part of the creation of a pluralistic and outward-looking society, or societies. The Nazi attempt to annihilate the Jews and Stalin's efforts to eradicate their culture ultimately failed. There are still Jews in Eastern Europe, And the rich culture that the Jews created here remains a source of admiration and inspiration to both Jews and non-Jews, and of course is at the center of what YIVO investigates. The Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski has written, "We study history not in order to know how to behave or how to succeed, but to know who we are. A knowledge of our history in Eastern Europe is an essential aspect of knowing who we are." I should like to conclude with the two quotations which I used as epigraphs for the third volume of my book, The Jews in Poland and Russia, which exemplify what I think was important in the history of the 20th century for Jews here. The first is from the poem by Uri Zvi Grinberg, Under Duress. He wrote, "We were forced to hate what we loved. We loved forest and brook, well and mill, falling leaves, fish, well bucket, challah. Secretly, we even loved the sound of their church bells, even the bleach-haired little Shkotzim. We loved the harmonica and flute, Ukrainian songs, village girls dancing in colorful rings, thatched cottages painted white with red rafters, winter's end dripping from their roofs. We were forced to leave great cities where we loved to smoke in cafes, opera, evening dress, perfumed hair, dance halls, opium, ballet, boulevards, whorehouses. Wrenched from the shtetls, we saw our houses in fire-filled tears, knowing they would burn in the end." And the second quotation is from Boris Pasternak's novel, Dr. Zhivago. He wrote, "Reshaping life. This is the idea of people who, whatever they have seen, have never known the essence of life or felt its spirit and its soul. For them, life is a lump of crude material in need of shaping and reshaping and untouched by their noble hands. But life is never simply material, a substance. If you would like to know, it is constantly renewing, transforming, remaking, and transfiguring itself. Life is beyond your and my obtuse theories about it." Thank you.
You should have a handout. Does everyone have one of these? Great. So thank you, first of all, to the organizers at YIVO and Posen. It's been a really interesting day, and I'm really honored to be a part of this panel. So I think I liked actually the way you ended with Uri Zvi Grinberg. I don't know whether that was from a Yiddish or a Hebrew poem. So it's fitting that it's from the Hebrew, because the ambivalence there that we heard in that poem, we were taught to hate what we loved, and then the very kind of the sensual detail of the Eastern European pastoral and urban landscapes, right? The brooks and the streams and the trees and the hills, but also the cafes, especially the cafes. The ambivalence that we see there in that quote from Uri Zvi, I think really permeates a lot of what I could bring to you, what I could speak about. I was asked to speak about the idea of the diaspora in Israeli culture, particularly in Israeli writing. What I would like to think about, and the earlier example, for those of you who are here for the earlier panel, when David Ruskies mentioned Grossman's novel, See Under Love, Ayin Erech Ahava, and the way in which that novel also recreates a kind of lost Eastern European paradise through the eyes of this 8-year-old child. There are a myriad examples, I think, within Israeli writing that treats that world of the Eastern European diaspora, the diaspora in the Levant of Levantine Jews, with a lot of ambivalence and with a lot of love. I want to try and go in a slightly different direction here, and to think about diaspora as a condition and not as a location, as a condition and not as a location, as a consciousness, as a kind of an awareness of a network of spatial relationships that suggests a community. And notice how I'm being sort of as abstract and as broad as possible here. Something with multiple centers, and multiple margins. And I'm going to do this by looking at 3 examples of recent Israeli novels. And I want to say that these are just 3 examples from many. In other words, I could put up 3 totally different novels and have a very different map for you here. Just pull this up a little bit. Hold on just a minute. I chose these examples because they're novels that I've read and because they're recent. So if we want to think about the shape of the Israeli diaspora beyond all the falafel places and some of the mentions of hummus and pita, the ubiquitous Shabbos table now items that we can find in many locations. Beyond that, but to think really of what an Israeli diaspora might look like in literary terms, we can look at these 3 very recent novels for some interesting ways in which the idea of diaspora, again, the idea of diaspora as a condition, but not as a specific place, emerges. And so I'm going to talk to you about these 3 very specific novels. The first one, by Maya Arad, Makom Acher Ve'ir Zara, Another Place, a Strange City, is a novel, a love story set in Tel Aviv, told in rhymed verse. The entire novel unfolds in rhymed verse. The second novel, Neuland, by Eshkol Nevo. Anybody recognize the title, Neuland? Anybody recognize that title, Neuland, what it's playing on? Alt-Neuland. So the utopian, sort of like the Rip Van Winkle of Hebrew literature, the utopian Hebrew novel written by that wonderful Viennese novelist, Theodor Herzl, as a kind of a political utopia about life as he envisioned it in the modern Jewish state. Alt-Neuland, Old New Land, the Hebrew translation of Alt-Neuland, anybody? Published as Tel Aviv, and this is where we get the name of the city, Tel Aviv. So this novel, Neuland, written by Eshkol Nevo, sort of begins in Tel Aviv, but then works its way out into different locations in Europe and in South America. That's the second novel. And then the third novel, Hebrew Publishing Company, a more recent entry, by Matan Hermoni. And that novel unfolds initially in the world of Yiddish theater and the Shund, the sort of trash Yiddish novels in New York in the early 20th century, and comes up into the present. So each of these novels, I want to suggest, engages different patterns of diaspora. Again, diaspora as a condition that we can think about in terms of some of the other ideas of diaspora that we'll hear about on the panel. So before I talk specifically about the map, I would just want to say that my email is on the handout, so if you want to actually have access to this map after the conference, then just shoot me an email and I will invite you to collaborate. So first of all, we're going to begin with the coffee cup. Here's Tel Aviv. This is the place where all of these novels are published, right? Maya Arad, Makom Acher Ve'ir Zara, Neuland, and Matan Hermoni. We'll begin with Maya Arad. Very interesting novelist who currently makes her home in Palo Alto. Oh, the technical. See? Hold on. You can't believe this has worked really nicely, and now it's not going to work. You're kidding me. Hold on just a minute. We'll go back to here. There's that again. I want to show you. Anyone? Tech advice? Here, we'll go here. Here we go. So author Maya Arad lives and writes in Palo Alto. Her book, Another Place, a Foreign Country, is a love story set in Tel Aviv and written in the style of a traditional Russian poema, a genre used to lovingly depict 19th century St. Petersburg. So we have here what I think, she's a kind of an exception that I'm imagining will prove the rule in future generations. She is an Israeli novelist, a Hebrew novelist, who has basically written all of her books while living in Palo Alto, but maintaining a kind of a live career back here, a publishing career back here in Tel Aviv. The book, Makom Acher Ve'ir Zara, again, is set in Tel Aviv, but it's told in the style of Pushkin, a kind of a love poem to Tel Aviv. Excuse me? Kind of a love poem to Tel Aviv. So that's my Arad. We can come back to that in a minute. I'm going to show you now the second example. This is Neuland. Neuland is also published in Tel Aviv, and its primary locales where most of the plot evolves, first of all in Berlin. One of the characters treks abroad, goes abroad to visit her mother, who is living with a German filmmaker. During her visit, they tour the city's sites, including the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. So you see the ways in which these kind of iconic sites become depicted in these novels as well. The other important site in Neuland is, of course, Argentina, where another of the novel's protagonists goes to look for his father, who has gone on he's sort of mimicking the treks that many Israelis take to Latin America, sort of a search for self, and we get this kind of postmodern Israeli pilgrimage juxtaposed with all of the Baron Hirsch-sponsored Jewish agricultural settlements in the late 19th and earliest century. So in a sense, it kind of parodies or draws on the utopian Zionist novel, but in a sort of a reverse direction. I don't know if you can see the image there. It says Avenida Baron Hirsch. This is in contemporary Argentina. And our final example here, Matan Hermoni. Hebrew Publishing Company, set largely in New York in the early decades of the 20th century. Hermoni's novel, Hebrew Publishing Company, masterfully mimics high and low Yiddish literary genres, including the travel narrative to tell the story of Mordechai Schuster, a Yiddish Schreiber, and his forays and failures in the world of Schund. And just to complete our picture, I will let you know that the author of Hebrew Publishing Company currently lives in Chicago. And his protagonist, Mordechai Schuster, passes through on the train on his way to San Francisco. We'll see one more pop up here of San Francisco, where Mordechai Schreiber, he visits a cousin of his, and he invents his literary heroine, Miss Annie Page of Cincinnati, Ohio, who goes on to feature in his very successful Yiddish novels about the Yiddish stage. So what do we have here from this map with all of these intersections? So the one thing that I would suggest is that diaspora in Israeli culture, or when we think about the idea of diaspora in Israeli culture, it no longer means necessarily or only this kind of ingathering of different cultural experiences, different languages, different cultural landscapes, if you will, from a homeland. It's now something much more conceptual, and the reason why I wanted to bring it to you in this fashion is because when we think about communities now, in the age of the internet, there are ways in which communities are being formed and communal bonds are being formed that sort of, in a sense, try to either overcome or replicate, both of those things, some of the more traditional bonds, so that you can think now of the substance of Yiddishkeit as emerging in all of these different locations. The other thing that we can think about in terms of Tel Aviv in particular, is that Tel Aviv is now a diaspora for other people as well. This is just a photograph of it's called the World of Pork. It's a store in the market in Tel Aviv where people from different traditions, people who are visiting in Israel, people who are living in Israel, go to buy their pork. I said pork, sorry. I did say pork. There's more that I could say, but I think I'm going to pause now and let our other panelists speak, and then we can pick up the conversation. Yeah? Okay, thank you.
Hi. So, as I think Jonathan said, I'm not an academic. I'm a practicing attorney and journalist. So I'm going to take that freedom and be a little playful up here because I can. And although I'm not an academic, I want to say that I am a professor of cryptozoology. And there's a technical meaning to crypto-Jews and cryptozoology, as I'm sure all of you know, which is the study of Jews after the period of expulsion from Spain. These were Jews who continued to practice Judaism while outwardly professing to be Christians. That does fall under my rubric, but it's not what I'm interested in. What I want to do is sort of put the dialectic of diaspora and center to the side a little bit, and I want to talk about something that is more, I find to be more productive, which is the dialectic of hidden versus revealed. So that's what cryptozoology to me is about, the study of hidden Jews and Judaism. And it's certainly been a theme of my own Jewish life, basically since I was a teenager and since I started studying Yiddish, that to me, it's been all about figuring out what is hidden, why it was hidden, and how we can make these things more revealed. And I think it's also an important lens for understanding American Jews today. Just as important, I think, as talking about diaspora and center. So I'm just going to read you a short excerpt from a chapter of my book. And of course, because I guess I'm showing my age, I'm still a little bit, I haven't gotten over the literature of my youth. So I'm talking here about a wonderful book for young adults called Mendelssohn the Boy from Mars. And it's the story of two kids who find each other. They're both new in school. They've both moved from cities to suburbs. And they're really bored. And they end up going on a quest together and developing psychic powers. And they really find themselves, and they go through identity crises together. So at this point in the book, they've gone into the city, and they've bought a system for developing their psychic powers from a flim-flam man named Samuel Klugarsh. So they've bought the system, they've developed some level of powers, and they go back, though, because they're bored with these powers. When they tell Klugarsh that they have been able to reach state 26, a mental state necessary to access psychic powers, he's astonished at their progress. He insists that they buy the next level of psychic training. It's called hyperstellar archaeology. And, as Klugarsh explains, it will help them find the so-called lost continents of Atlantis, Mu, and Lemuria. He tells them that the course in hyperstellar archaeology will, quote, equip you to find the everyday clues to the existence of civilizations no longer with us. Now, at this point in the analysis, I have to insert myself and my story. Mendelssohn the Boy from Mars is obviously a book I remember fondly from my own childhood. And as a kid who was bullied, I related to the nerd as hero and the possibility that there was an adventure waiting for me and my unique abilities. But as an adult, the story had even more relevance. As someone who learned Yiddish at university and not from home, I couldn't ask for a better description of what it feels like to enter into the study of the Yiddish language and culture than what Klugarsh calls hyperstellar archaeology. Once I started learning Yiddish, I found it everywhere. I suddenly knew what people's last names meant. I understood what Geschlafen meant, which is what my mother used to say to me. I understood why we lay in Torah and my friends had an ufruf before they got married. Growing up, the Yiddish world might as well have been Atlantis to me. It had existed at one point, but the way it was remembered was mostly through its cataclysmic destruction. And just as we have no way of knowing what life in Atlantis was like, the subtext of any discussion of Eastern European culture was that its everyday life, as opposed to its death, is just as removed and unknowable to us as Atlantis. Yiddish Eastern Europe became mythic in more ways than one. It was mythic in the sense that it was the necessary trial by fire out of which emerged the new state of Israel. The old had to be destroyed to make way for the new. Further, Yiddish Eastern Europe was mythic in that because it was lost, it was something to which we could never return, nor would we need to. Rather, Yiddish Eastern Europe would from now on function as a mirror for contemporary society, just like countless generations have been fascinated by Atlantis and have seen themselves in its life and destruction. so Jews today are able to look into the mirror of the Yiddish Atlantis and see whatever they needed to. So that's just the excerpt I wanted to read. And I find that this dialectic of hidden and revealed really opens things up in other ways too. So for example, I want to talk about pseudo-history, right? So people who study things like Atlantis, the construction of the pyramid and the Sphinx, some of these things are real, obviously. The Great Pyramid is real, the Sphinx is real, Atlantis is not real. But these things belong to the province of what I would generously call pseudo-historians. Some people might say crackpot, but we're going to say pseudo-historians. There's an enormous literature out there by these people who deliberately situate themselves outside the margins of legitimate scholarship in history. And they have a very different take on things. And so what happens is that you have an entire field which is given over to amateurs, to the self-taught, to autodidacts who have a very different take on things. But because they are the ones who control the dialogue about something like Atlantis, they're the ones who speak as experts on it. And if you've turned on the History Channel at any time recently, you can see these people on there talking about UFOs, they're talking about Bigfoot. It's very interesting, and this is pseudo-history and pseudo-scholarship at work. So what you have, though, as it applies to contemporary Jewish life and Yiddish, is that on the one hand, you have two groups who have, I would say, a legitimate ownership of Yiddish today, of spoken, fluent Yiddish, right? You have a group of academics for whom it's a job, they are fluent in it, they teach it, they make it part of their lives. This is a relatively small group of people. And then you have a much larger group, which is the Yiddish-speaking ultra-Orthodox, located mostly, let's say, in Brooklyn. And they have socio-theological reasons for using Yiddish as vernacular. However, those two groups, in general, have very little to do with the Jewish American mainstream popular culture. Most Jews have nothing to do with those two groups. However, on the popular culture level, what happens is that the conversation about Yiddish is often taken over by what I would call pseudo-historians, pseudo-linguists, pseudo-scholars in general. So you have this whole phenomenon of things like Yiddish for babies, Yiddish for dogs, which are, I mean, not just silly and riddled with errors, but just kind of ludicrous. For example, on Twitter, I follow somebody just because I enjoy to hate it, a person who calls himself Alterkacker. So if you know Twitter, you have these very short, 140 characters, you tweet as often as you feel like, and they come across your screen. So Alterkacker has taken it upon himself to tweet Yiddish words and phrases. But it's very clear that he doesn't actually speak Yiddish because you can tell he has copied and pasted from various books like Yiddish for Dogs and Yiddish for Babies because his transliteration is all over the place. It's totally inconsistent. And also it's very, very often wrong. Okay, so and he has 4,000 followers on Twitter, which is astonishing. And it's astonishing that he has that many followers and that many people are getting incorrect information about Yiddish. So this is what I'm talking about when I talk about pseudo-history and how its pseudo-scholarship, unfortunately, has taken control of the Yiddish narrative in American popular culture. And what it creates is a sort of mystification of Yiddish. It takes what would otherwise be obvious and plain to see and makes it mystical or mystifies it. So, in fact, we have here at YIVO a real capital of Atlantis, as it were, right? And yet these people who put themselves out there as authorities never acknowledge the fact that YIVO exists. They don't acknowledge, for example, that YIVO has a very easy-to-learn standard orthography for transliteration. So one of my problems with somebody like Alterkacker on Twitter is that his transliteration is all over the place. If he had taken 5 minutes to learn YIVO standard transliteration, in fact, he would make it a lot easier for the people who follow him to learn how to pronounce things. As it is, because he's all over the place, it further mystifies what would, in fact, just be plainly evident. So there are other examples I could give about this tension between the hidden and the revealed, and using that as a way of looking at American culture and how it relates to its history. But maybe I'll just leave that there for now, and we can sort of expand on other things.
Thank you. Does anybody want to start? I have.
Yes, I'd like to start. I'd like to make 3 points. The first point, and this relates to what you said, galut, doesn't mean diaspora, it means exile. And in traditional Jewish life, this exile was supposed to come to an end with the Messianic event. The end, or at least the break with traditional Jewish society, which began in the 18th century, led first to the attempt to integrate Jews, to transform them into citizens of the respective countries where they lived. And when this ran into difficulties, one response was Zionism, and Zionism essentially argued that the whole experience of the diaspora was negative and should be rejected. Classic Zionism rested on the idea, I mean, one could talk about, there are various variants here, and Ahad Ha'am has a different view, but Ben Gurion Zionism rested on Shlilat HaGolah, the rejection of the diaspora. And what's happened now, I think, in this context, is that in the American context, we have become, I think that the emergence of Israel clearly does change our situation here and everywhere in the diaspora, although it's much more problematic now in Europe, where, at least in Western Europe, where the idea of a Jewish national state is called into question. But in Israel, as you showed in your paper, the concept of Shlilat HaGolah has really gone, and the desire to re-establish some understanding of the Jewish life in the diaspora is at the center of a lot of things. This leads to a second point. Obviously, my field is Eastern Europe, and one tends therefore to think this is all that really matters. But there were other Jewish diasporas, and I think it's important to talk about the Oriental, the Mizrahi diaspora, and also the German Jewish diaspora, which overlaps with the East European Jewish diaspora. Many of the most important German Jewish writers, or Jewish writers who wrote in German, came from Eastern Europe, Karl Emil Franzos, or from Central Europe, Franz Kafka and others. But we're talking about more than one diaspora here. The third point, which I think is very important in the context of understanding Eastern Europe, is that in both Russia and Poland, the integration of the Jews, the transformation of the Jews into citizens, did not succeed for a whole series of reasons. In Poland, because of the development of the way in which Polish society developed in the second half of in the 1930s, and in the Soviet Union because of the changes in Soviet policy towards the Jews, which really start in 1939 but come to a head with Stalin's persecution of the Jewish writers. So that in the end, the Jews came to see themselves in this area and came to be seen by the surrounding population as a national rather than as an ethnic or rather than as a religious group, and ultimately this led to those who remained mostly emigrating. At the same time, there's a paradox here, and this of course is related to Yiddish. Yiddish was in decline in Eastern Europe. All of the figures in Poland by 1939 show that Yiddish was declining. The figures for the books which younger Jews were taking out of the Jewish libraries, like the Grosser Library in Warsaw, or the Wilna Library, or the library in Białystok, they were mostly taking out books in Polish. And there was an increasing number of Jews writing in Polish. The same was happening on an even more rapid scale in the Soviet Union, where Russification was encouraged by the government, but was also enthusiastically taken up by Jews. So alongside the flourishing of Yiddish and the emergence of new Yiddish writers in these areas in the 1920s and the 1930s, both in Poland and in the Soviet Union, there is also the emergence of major writers in Polish and Russian. It's not really possible to understand Polish literature in the 20th century without thinking of people like Leszmian, Tuwim, Antoni Slonimsky, or after the Second World War, people like Henryk Grinberg or Hanna Krall, whom I quoted, Stanislav Vygotsky, and many others. In the case of the Russian world, one only has to think of people like Isaac Babel or Osip Mandelstam, or even Pasternak, a rather questionable Jew, but still a great writer. And we've also seen an explosion of Russian Jewish writing since the end of communism. So it's very important, I think, not to see Eastern Europe as unchanging in the way that Abraham Joshua Heschel saw it, as a repository of Yiddish which had got lost in the United States. The same process by which Jews adopted the language of the majority and produced important literature in the language of the majority was happening there. And here I'd just like to add to the earlier discussion what marks this Jewish literature as distinct from literature in Yiddish, which at some level is written primarily for Jews. I mean, it did get translated. Bashevis thought of being translated. But this literature was a literature which was outsider-insider. There's one in Ilya Ehrenburg's novel, The Life of Julio Juranito, there's an episode where Julio Juranito, this Mexican Diego Rivera figure, a revolutionary who has a group of disciples following him, says the 20th century is not going to be like the 19th century. It's going to be a century of violence and of persecution. And one element in this is going to be a new auto da fe of the Jews, a new persecution of the Jews. And his followers, who are stereotypical examples of different national groups, all say, Master, this is wrong. You're quite incorrect. But he says, I will perform a simple experiment which will prove that I am right. I want you to choose between two words. And the two words are yes and no. And you have to explain why you choose the word you choose. So the American chooses yes because life is positive and you have to take an optimistic attitude. The Frenchman because he likes to have a good meal and he has a mistress. The German because life is efficient. The Russian because this is the way things work. The only person who chooses no is the Jewish character who is given the name Ilya Ehrenburg, actually. And everybody gradually moves away from him. And what marks this literature is that it both is part of a larger literary tradition, but it says no to that literary tradition. And that's true of a lot of American Jewish literature.
I think it's also, if I may, a generational. In other words, I would just historicize that no. During the break, I was having a conversation with someone, and we both sort of said, well, you know, I asked him, he related to me a story about his mother of a certain age. I said, where is she from? I told him, you know, where my mother was from. And I think that the time and when that conversation will, it is increasingly an irrelevant conversation within the American Jewish community, as more and more of us have parents who are from here, who are not from there. I mean, I think it's just it's a kind of a fact, and it occurred to me as I was having this conversation that this is not a conversation that my daughter will have with her peers, or even that she will have with the same regularity that I have it, for example, in my professional life. So I would say the historicizing, just to historicize this kind of the no within the riches of. This is the same point that came up in one of the morning sessions with the sort of the turning away from a tradition that you have. Not saying that secularism is an absence of tradition, but sort of choosing secularism over tradition that you weren't here this morning, but choosing secularism as a choice against a tradition that that you sort of, you had in your home. I want to just say one more thing about this, the idea of diaspora and overlapping diasporas. So, for example, within Israeli writing, we find Mizrahi authors who are revisiting, for example, Cairo, Alexandria, a very rich Iraqi Jewish writers in Hebrew and in Arabic, thinking about Baghdad in the interwar period. So there is, I would say that this is a long-lived trend within Israeli writing among writers of different generations, usually the second generation. In other words, either the first generation that's arrived their children revisit it in a different way. And so I think it's significant that these three writers that I'm talking about now, Arad, Neveu, and Harmony, they're well under 40. I mean, this is a very different take on that world. In other words, they're not operating out of any kind of learned experience. And so for the case of Harmony, I would be, when the book is, I would love to hear what you have to say really about his take on this Yiddish Atlantis, because for him, in that book, the Atlantis is here. It's YIVO in New York. In other words, it's American Jewish Yiddish culture in the interwar period, in the early decade or so of the 20th century. In other words, it's not the center, the lost center is not Eastern Europe, it's here, it's New York, it's American Jewish culture in New York, please.
So that actually leads into a point that I've been thinking about a lot, and I was hoping I would find an entry point here, which is about, I think this is also a generational thing. I see shifting diaspora in center, right?
Oh, I'm fascinated that Alta Kakar has 4,000 followers.
Oh my
That's
God.
amazing.
Yeah, it's atrocious. So now you said that you think, oh, there will be a point where you're not going to have these conversations about where your parents are from. Now, all four of my grandparents were born in the United States. Okay. Well, but here's the thing. Actually, the chapter that I read you from is about social mobility and about the effect of mobility on American Jewish culture, especially for people of my generation and younger. So that actually, my dad is from Philadelphia. I'm the product of two parents who moved to New York so that I grew up without any immediate family in New York. And I would posit that today, for people like me, people younger, internal migrations of the kind that Oscar Handlin talked about is just as important as the migration from Eastern Europe was for people of older generations. So I still have those conversations where I'll say, oh yeah, my dad's from Philly, and somebody will say, oh yeah, my dad is too. Did he go to Central? Oh my God, that's really cool. And to go further into it, my dad is not just from Philly, he's from Logan, a Jewish neighborhood which really doesn't exist anymore. I mean, my dad has his own Atlantis. I have a place where my dad is from, I could never go back there, which makes it all the more mythical. So these things keep getting reproduced, just as diaspora and center keeps getting reproduced. I think it's a thematic thing we're not going to leave.
And I'm an American, I have a passport to prove it. Since I just arrived. But I think that one of the differences between America since the mid-1960s, probably, or maybe 1970s, is that anti-Semitism has not played an important part in American life. There are a whole series of reasons for this. The fact that there was a black underclass here, the fact that anti-Catholicism was important, maybe also the American Constitution and the separation of church and state. So the generation, your generation, has not experienced what I've experienced. I grew up in South Africa and I spent most of my adult life in England. These are countries where anti-Semitism is like ether in the atmosphere. I mean, you can smell it all the time. It's not threatening. It's not actually a problem in the sense that nobody's going to beat you up, but you are always conscious that you are part of an out-group. Now, that doesn't exist in the same sense in the United States, and that obviously has some. It's very good, obviously, I wouldn't advocate the alternative, but we have lived in the diaspora for a very long time with this consciousness that the surrounding world doesn't really like us. Maybe some people in it do, but by and large, we are not fully part of it. We want to be more part of it. Maybe what we need to do in order to become more part of it means giving up too much. This is a problem which one doesn't face in the same way in the United States.
Well, I would like to ask a question based on the conversation, which is coming back to the theme of this panel, which is reinvigorating the diasporas. As the memory of Eastern Europe fades, and as Rachel was saying, we know less and less on a first-hand basis of what life actually was like, often because our parents didn't tell us anything, they transmitted very little, and so on and so forth. And you have to come to the YIVO Institute and actually study in order to begin to understand that. But as it fades for the majority of American Jews, as a living daily reality. And as religion is also something that they don't necessarily embrace with unthinking and spontaneous affirmation, what is it that is going to reinvigorate? And maybe the word diaspora is the wrong word. Maybe we're framing the problem in the wrong way. Is this really a diaspora that exists here, or is it a separate entity, or is there a continuum between what is here and what is in Israel and what is in Poland and what is in Buenos Aires and what is all over the rest of the world because of technology? And is this, in other words, a problem that is only a thought problem, but in reality, people are dealing concretely in different ways? But the question remains, what is going to give new energy and new life? Clearly, the world of Eastern Europe, the energy of Eastern Europe that came to this country through our parents or grandparents or our great-grandparents, through the professors and the artists and the musicians that came either before the war or after the war, through the survivors of the Holocaust with their incredible experience and stories, that provided an impetus and a self-awareness. And what is taking the place of that now, or does nothing need to take the place of that now?
Well, I definitely have some thoughts about this. I mean, again, to go back to the theme of the tension between what is hidden and what is revealed, you know, we're faced with, if you look at the statistics, right, from the latest surveys, and it shows that something like, you know, 90%, 80% of American Jews have no Jewish literacy, they're unengaged, they're alienated from what is considered legitimate mainstream Judaism, which is defined by sociologists as belonging to a synagogue. Right? So how did we get to this point? Well, for example, you look at the fact that in the late 1940s, the IWO, wait, can you raise your hand if you know what the IWO is? Okay, good. So I'm talking to people who know. Most people will say, oh, IWW, yeah, Wobblies. Okay. So at one point, at its peak, the IWO had 50,000 Jewish members. At one point, it was the largest left-wing political membership organization in the United States. Now, the IWO almost does not exist in popular consciousness today, but the fact is that if there were 50,000 members at its peak, and there were a lot more people who weren't members but were associated with it, and today we can't even talk about the IWO. There are all those people out there whose grandparents belong to that organization, and there's a reason why then they didn't become synagogue goers, that they have a very different Jewish experience that is not in harmony with the official Jewish narrative, right? So that these people are left sort of adrift and alienated with no one to speak for them and their history, right? Because for whatever reasons, let's say that history is taboo or it's delegitimized or whatnot. We won't get into that right now. So I think that you have to address the effect that these disconnects have created within the American Jewish community. You have so many people who are delegitimized by the mainstream Jewish narrative. So what I would say is that you have to have a sort of a radical program of self-knowledge, sort of along the lines of somebody like Avram Golom, who was a great Yiddish pedagogue and thinker about the future of the Jewish people. And one of his most important talking points, as it is, was cultural autonomy. That Jews, if they were not going to stay within a traditional religious community, they had to have a program of self-knowledge and education about Jewish history, and they had to have a very high level of Jewish literacy. So I think, like, there's so much basic work that needs to be done for the majority of American Jews today to know the very basic things about their parents and grandparents and the way that they engaged with Jewishness, and that they actually had a Jewish identity, and maybe that Jewish identity involved the Jewish People's Fraternal Order. Well, they need to know that, and they need to know that doesn't make them a bad Jew, it makes them a Jew with an interesting history, and that brought them to a certain place, and they have to have a voice.
I think that... Sorry, please.
Well, there's a lot of, I mean, I'm going to reframe the question. I mean, the reinvigorating the diasporas, it assumes that they're moribund or that there's there's some sort of sickness or malaise. And again, I mean, I'm not a historian or a sociologist, so I don't know how to, wouldn't know exactly how to. Excuse me, just a moment. So I wouldn't know entirely how to measure that. I would welcome comments from the audience with that information. But I think that I resonate a lot with what you said, that there is this kind of profound lack of self-knowledge, but even more so, it seems to me, a lack of a desire for knowledge in terms of one's Jewishness. And so, you know, maybe there's some simple explanation like education. Don't know about that. I mean, I think that there is a sense in which when I look at, for example, the blogosphere, or when I look at, you know, one of the measures of Jewish culture that I bring to my own work and that I think about in my own community is the degree to which the Jewish environmental movement, for example, or the Jewish presence within the environmental movement has really taken off through groups like Chazon, things like that. The Jew and the Carrot, for example, you know, that these are all indications of a kind of a liveliness, a kind of a vitality. And they're not in those brick and mortar institutions. They're not in that synagogue affiliation. They're not in day schools. And now I'm just coming to these questions as a parent myself, you know. But they are, there is, I think, a kind of a lifeblood that is still streaming there. We just need to find it, look for it in those perhaps unconventional ways. And I would just say one more word about Israel. Maybe it's another round of comments. I think that there was a point where Israeli culture, particularly Hebrew writing, there was a desire and a belief that would be the point. That would, I mean, that quote that you read about Yesh Atid, you know, that Israel would somehow be the tether. And I think that's pretty much done as a question for younger generation in this country.
I'd make 3 points. The first is that over a very long period, Jews were at least bilingual, whether it was Hebrew or Yiddish, or whether it was Yiddish and the language of the surrounding population. We've lost bilingualism, and that's a real loss. And one of the problems in Israeli-American diaspora relations is that so few people here are comfortable in reading the Hebrew press, for instance, don't really follow what's going on in Israel, don't understand the nature of the debates. And that's a problem which needs to be addressed. I'm not quite sure how. The second issue is nobody really inherits a culture. You have to acquire it. And there is a problem here with what people read. And David was talking about Shalom Aleichem. So much of the classics of Yiddish literature are not easily available. We've been very good at creating buildings and museums, but we've not been good at having publishing programs. David talked about Julian Strahovski today, one of the major Polish Jewish writers. Only one of his books, and he wrote quite a lot, he wrote 4 novels on Galicia and then 3 biblical novels. Only one of these is available in English. We need to have more translated, and we need to have the translation more available. Thirdly, I don't agree with Novick that we have made the Holocaust too central in Jewish education, but it's a question of what we teach about the Holocaust. We wanted to teach not only the process of mass murder, but also the nature of what was destroyed and how it fitted into the longer trajectory of Jewish history. I quoted from people who went on the March of the Living, and what I would say there is that the March of the Living, for all its faults, does actually create people who've been in Eastern Europe and are interested in many of them have been critical of what they were given in these educational tourism. But this is something which does excite interest. I think that one of the characteristics of Jews is that they are great tourists. I mean, wherever you go, you find Jewish tourists. And this is particularly now true of Eastern Europe. And certainly the establishment of the Museum of Jewish History in Warsaw and the other museums which already exist in Poland, the museum in Dnipropetrovsk, the museum in Moscow, these are places people will go to. And when people go to them, they will also meet the people who run them, who are also Jews, who have a rather different perspective on what they're doing. And after all, and I think that this is a very positive development. And out of this, I think, will come a new understanding. One of the things that makes communities, which is in a sense what these diasporas are, easier to establish is the internet. I mean, the internet has many, like everything, it's a double-edged sword, and it creates also self-perpetuating communities of extremists of all sorts. But it also enables groups of quite small Jews to communicate with others. This is the situation with Beit Warszawa, for instance, the Reform Jewish community in Warsaw, which has a website and a newsletter, and through this has a lot of input from people in the United States. I think that we need to work on these links and to strengthen them.
I think we'll end there. Thank you very much, and we'll take questions from the audience.
Their identity is an identity which is an ethnic identity. And in that case, it's an identity which, and I brought up this before, children learn their identity from their parents, and the construct of that identity is also part of that. And I wonder if you would comment on that.
I can just speak as a parent. It's true that children learn from their parents, but they also learn enormously from their peers and from the institutions that we send them to, unless you homeschool your child, but even then. So I'm not really sure about how to answer the question. It seems to me, I would go back to this idea of culture is not something that you inherit, it's something that you construct, that there is a kind of you have to be proactive, we have to be proactive perhaps in thinking about the future, but it's a bi-directional sort of thing. Do you want to say something?
I made the point is because many people talked about schooling in a communal fashion, teaching children about Jewish tradition, about religion and so forth in a communal atmosphere rather than an individual one. And in the construct of the individual, people will teach their children. I mean, I have 3 different children who are schooling their children in 3 different ways about their Jewish identity. And I think there's just as much variation for other people as well.
I think the problem really is that attempts to create a secular Jewish identity are brought into... The problem with a secular Jewish identity is how to pass it on to the next generation. Because David described Montreal when he grew up there. Johannesburg, where I grew up, was rather like that. The Jews were completely separate from the other groups in the society. They interacted with them, but everything took place within this Jewish environment. There was no issue about whether one was Jewish or not. It was just what sort of Jewishness one wanted to express. In a society where all opportunities, or most opportunities, are open to Jews, it's more difficult to transfer this identity to the next generation. And I think there that probably some religious component is probably necessary, although I'm not sure quite how this should be introduced and what one really means by it. But I have a certain amount of doubt about whether a non-religious Jewish identity can be communicated over several generations. I'd be very happy if it could be, but I have some doubts about this.
Yeah, this may be related to the previous questions, and I question whether it really is possible to communicate Jewish identity more than a few generations. I know my parents, I know my grandparents. A few of us may be fortunate enough to know great-grandparents. Beyond that, our ancestors are mythical people to us. They really we don't have any real connection to them. Is it possible for us to connect to them, and particularly to connect to the shtetl that they came from?
I would just like to add one more element to this. We talk about Jewish identity, but today in the panels we have been singularly unsuccessful in trying to identify what that is with respect to a secular Jewish identity. And I think that it's easy to say what a religious Jewish identity is because there are outward markings of it, because there are rituals that affirm it. There are seasonal celebrations that affirm it. There is a community around it. Secular Jewish identity is often a private affair. It's often a matter of one's own, as we were saying on the first panel, a matter of questioning, which can become nothing more than a mannerism, unless it has it can become an ironic mannerism, unless it is informed with content of some sort.
I'm sorry,
and so I think the problem that Anthony is alluding to of transmitting this beyond a generation is a very real and a very difficult one.
I would just say I consider myself a secular Jew, and I have a devotion to Jewish texts, but not for the sake of Shamayim, as it was worded this morning. In other words, I think that secular, I wouldn't call it secular Judaism, but secular Jewishness or secular Jewish culture is enormously rich and not at all reflexive or manneristic.
I'm not saying it isn't rich.
It can be
world.
devoted to those same texts, those same customs, those same rituals, those same spaces. In other words, in terms of
but we
the
don't have a
content
Pesach
column.
for Sholem Aleichem.
But the kibbutz has a say. The kibbutz in Israel, the kibbutz movement has a seder. You know, there's a very rich tradition now of Passover Agadot, which the kibbutz movement has produced over the past 5 or 6 decades. And they would not consider themselves religious. We might look at them and say, well, you know, this is the same text that are, you know, Arami Oved Avi. You know, they use those texts that we might recognize as religious, but the context in which they perform them is vastly different. They are secular texts.
I'd like to return to a different topic, which is Israel-diaspora relations. I talked about Shlilat HaGolah, but Achad Ha'am's concept was that a majority of Jews now probably do live in the state of Israel, but he thought that the Jewish settlement state, I don't think he was thinking of a state, but the Jewish settlement in Palestine would be a cultural center which would radiate Jewish values over the whole world and which would therefore preserve the Jewish character of the diaspora. Now, there was a period when this could be seen as a model, but we now have a situation where there are some people in Israel with whom we identify and there are others with whom we do not. And this is likely to become increasingly problematic. And I think that the problem, to some extent, is the lack of a structure. Personally, I don't care for the present, he's not actually Prime Minister at present, but Netanyahu, but there's nothing I can do about it because I don't live in Israel and I don't vote in Israel and I don't serve in the Israeli army as a reserve. And when people say, who are you to tell us what we should be doing? I do understand this, but there should be some structure whereby Israel-diaspora relations are institutionalized. Now, you may say the Conference of Presidents does this. Well, there are all these institutions, but none of them work correctly. Yeah. Well, maybe that'll have... But, well, I don't think they are financially that dependent on us. That's one of the issues. Israel doesn't need the diaspora financially as it did.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes, in all, this entire day, with the 4 panels, I listened very intently, there was never a mention of the current, secular, humanistic Jewish organization, Culture for Humanistic Judaism, is alive and well. It's smaller than we would like to know, but there was no representation. The Arbiter Ring, the Workman's Circle, I mean, they're alive. IWO is dead, but why talk about the dead when I don't know where all these people affiliate in communities? But there are secular, humanistic communities, Jewish, observing in a humanistic, secular way the major Jewish holidays, and are involved in Tikkun Olam and involved in with the Israeli relationships, and they should be represented here. So I'm a little disappointed with that.
Can I say something? Okay, I just want to say that I think that an important thing to keep in mind when we talk about religious versus secular or diaspora center is that these things are not fixed endpoints, that secular is not an endpoint, religious is not an endpoint, and that in an ideal world, all of these communities and all of these expressions of Jewishness are not only in dialogue, but recognize each other for the value that they add. And also, I would hope that we all recognize that each person is on a journey. So no person is a fixed secularist or fixed religious person or whatever. That in my own life, I've seen so many people go on journeys from being not Jews to becoming observant Jews, from being not observant Jews to observant Jews, in every direction. So that I feel like we all need, and I think you make a good point, we all need a more dynamic recognition, a dynamic approach to Jewish life, and recognizing all the parts and how they're all in dialogue with each other.
May I make a short reply? I grew up as a secular, from a product of an intermarriage. But my mother taught me Yiddish, spoke to me in Yiddish, cooked Jewish food, and I was a secular American who happened to be part Jewish. But I became a secularist. I became not only interested in other people's culture, which was part of my education, various ethnic cultures, I became very interested in the Jewish ethnic culture in the diaspora, wherever it is. It's just a fantastic world to learn about and just keep learning. So it's an evolution.
Thank you.
But in community, if you're not going to be discussing it in community, you're just isolated, individual. We need to reach out.
Thank you.
My daughter, who's now 26, was bat mitzvahed through the Society for Humanistic Judaism, through an affiliated congregation here in New York, the City Congregation for Humanistic Judaism. Last year she went on Taglit, birthright, to Israel for 3 months, and then stayed on and worked in an orphanage, a very life-changing, or a very important event for her. She's very well schooled in asking questions. She's a graduate student today. But referring to your point, to your question at the very beginning during the first panel about, is this just a mannerism without the content? Of course it's a mannerism that's pretty thin gruel, being skeptical, ironic, and being proud of that, knowing it comes somehow from your tradition, your background, your parents, or something like that. But absent the immersion in learning and knowledge of texts, it is pretty thin. So I'm thinking the Taglit thing has been pretty successful. At least it's brought large numbers to Israel. Is it impossible to roll out some kind of a basic course in, let's call it Jewish history, Jewish literacy, but text-based, that would attempt to impart?
I will make one plug for the YIVO Institute here.
Yeah.
This is precisely what our ambition is to do in developing a master's degree program in connection with Bard College on East European Jewish civilization. We've now had 2 very successful winter programs, each of which is run for 3 weeks. We're going to be extending this, we hope, into a 6-week program, but I agree with you completely.
We've tried at Brandeis to create a course on basic Jewish literacy. What I would say is that it's clear that in Israel the secular religious divide is one of the most serious problems which the country faces, and it may well be that it's also something of a problem here, although the ultra-Orthodox and the Orthodox don't have much to do with people like the people in this audience for the most part. But I think that if we are to talk to the religious, that is the Orthodox section of the Jewish world, which is growing, we have to talk from a position of knowledge. There was some talk earlier about Talmud. I mean, we have to know what the Talmud is about. We have to know what the basic Jewish texts are, even if we reject the way in which these are handled by the Orthodox. And I think that this is a problem of Jewish literacy, that we don't have this at present. The way Sunday school education in synagogues, particularly or temples here, particularly Reform and Conservative, has not been a success. Maybe the day schools, I'm not in favor of day schools basically, but if you don't have people going through day schools, you also have a lack of education here. This is one of the problems which we need to deal with. This is something which the Posen Foundation is very active in, but in order to engage and I think this is well realized in Israel, the various commissions on Jewish literacy in schools in Israel have dealt with this.
Not just literacy.
Yes. Well, yes.
Of any kind.
Well, that's a different question. Yes, quite. But I think that we won't make progress on creating some sort of dialogue or some sort of understanding of different positions unless we talk from a position of, unless we can demonstrate that we know what they are talking about.
Yeah, well, I want to say something, perhaps this is an unpopular position to take, but that if we had taken all the billions of dollars that have been invested in the birthright program and decided that every Jew in the United States who wants a comprehensive Jewish day school education is going to get it, right now, we would have the most vibrant, extensive, amazing network of Jewish schools in the world. And for the amount of money that has been spent on sending kids on vacation to Israel, every child in the United States who wanted to could have an excellent Jewish education. But that takes a political will, that takes a commitment to education, that takes a belief in education. I mean, there's a failure here.
Can I agree with that for a second?
Yes,
and just to add, for adults, the Context program, formerly MEA, which the Jewish Theological Seminary runs now, adult education in communities all over the Northeast. This is a program that is specifically dedicated to creating Jewish literacy. It's not for kids, okay? But I have to say, I mean, I think we can believe that we need to be literate and we need to be knowledgeable, or else we can't have that conversation. But I think we need to be literate and knowledgeable for the sake of literacy and knowledge. Yes. I don't think, there's no amount of Talmud that I can know that would enable me to be welcome in certain conversations, yes, particularly in Israel. So I think, you know, and the secular religious divide is configured so radically differently there. I'm sure you know, just yes, and it's embedded in ethnic issues and in political issues and in economic issues in a way that it isn't here. Although this question of Taglit versus Jewish day schools, I think, is actually a great point.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
I would like to protest something you said, Professor Polanski, if you will indulge me. You mentioned small communities in Eastern Europe. You mentioned Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Poland as small and declining communities. Now, it may be true of all the other ones, but it's actually not true for Poland, which is, I think it's actually more significant that nobody in this room would know this, that the Polish community is one of the only 2 communities in the world that is actually growing since the collapse of communism. It's very small, and it doesn't grow in Jewish babies. It grows in people coming out of the closet as Jews, as some of you probably have heard. Now that was a comment, but my question relates to this comment. you mentioned that it's, there appears to be a consensus with regard to the fact that in constructing Jewish identity, in America for that matter, we learn about the Jewish past. So we learn about Polish Jewish history, learn about the Holocaust, and so on. Now, there no longer appears to be a consensus about learning anything about the Jewish present in Europe, for example. 75% of American Jews are Polish Jews, roughly. My question is, how come American Jews are interested in studying Jewish history in Poland, but not interested in the Polish Jews? Do not find it relevant to their identity?
Well, I think that when I said declining, what I meant was that huge efforts have been made, and I would say the same is true of Russia and Ukraine. But we don't know whether they'll succeed, because one of the problems with the Polish Jewish community is that so many of the children of the people who have created these communities, who are responsible for the revival of Jewish life, live outside Poland for various reasons. And this, I mean, but without going into the issue here, on the question of American Jewish attitudes to Eastern Europe and to the study of Eastern Europe, I think that there is a great deal of prejudice to be overcome, unquestionably. And there are reasons for this prejudice, but it is fundamentally irrational and harmful. But it's diminishing, and there is now, I think, a widespread understanding here that Poland particularly has made a successful transition, perhaps the most successful in East Central Europe, a transition to a plural political system and to a market economy, and that the health of the Jewish community there is dependent to some extent on this transition, and more people are going there, and as a result there's more interest. The problem, of course, you know, in terms of longer issues is you can't really study Poland without knowing Polish, and you can't really study Russia without knowing Russian. And we come back there to the problem of unwillingness of people in the United States to learn foreign languages. The Adam Mickiewicz Society, which is the Polish equivalent of the Alliance Française, should encourage more people, particularly Jews, to study Polish in Poland. I think this would be a very good thing and would create much greater understanding of a lot of issues, but it's a little utopian, I'm afraid.
I think that's it. Thank you.